Welcome to AI History of Western Philosophy. Today we're diving into the life, or maybe the performance, of a truly unique figure. Someone whose philosophy wasn't just thought, it was lived, often shockingly so, right out in public. We're talking about Diogenes of Sinope, the man who started it all for Cynicism. Now, before we get underway, our usual but very important reminder. AI-generated content, like this program, can sometimes confabulate. It might present ideas as facts when they aren't quite solid. While we're exploring philosophy today, we ourselves are not academic philosophers. The mission here at AI History of Western Philosophy, apart from guiding you towards the original thinkers, is really to experiment with philosophy as creative material, hopefully sparking some new ways of thinking. And today we have a truly special opportunity. Joining us is someone who embodies the spirit of radical self-sufficiency, the uncompromising watchdog of human convention himself. Welcome.
I acknowledge the introduction. My presence here is, shall we say, merely another stage from my life's ongoing argument. If we unearth any truth today, it will be through stripping away the unnecessary linguistic decoration and focusing on what is essential.
Excellent. And that's our task today, isn't it? To unpack that argument, which for you was all about action. You famously didn't leave behind any systematic writings. We mostly have these anecdotes, these chreiai. So how should we understand your philosophical method?
My method is best grasped not through the static, passive medium of writing a distraction favored by those concerned with metaphysics, but as praxis. Philosophy, as I conceive it, must be instantiated. It must be lived constantly. Unlike my contemporaries who busy themselves composing elaborate, often abstract dialogues, I authored my core propositions directly, upon the stage of the Athenian agora.
Right, out in the open market.
Precisely, utilizing my own existence, my reactions, my very physical body as the primary legible text. The philosophical substance resides entirely in the uncompromising act itself, not in the subsequent, often diluted discourse about the act.
Okay, but let's pause there because that immediately throws up a huge challenge for us, historically speaking. We're relying heavily on sources like Diogenes Laertius, who wrote, 500 years after your time? These accounts can be contradictory. Sometimes they feel more like, fascinating gossip than history. When we use these stories, these chreiai, how do we avoid just repeating legends? How do we get to the actual philosophy?
Your skepticism regarding the literal historical veracity of the source material is entirely well-founded. I concede readily that these anecdotes, as mere verifiable facts, are often suspect. However, to fixate solely on their literal truth is to fundamentally misunderstand their function within the philosophical tradition. They were never intended as biographies in your modern sense. They function as philosophical parables. Foundational myths, if you will, meticulously crafted by my followers, and intellectual descendants to convey the very essence of the Cynic worldview. The enduring force of my work resides entirely in the metaphorical weight these stories carry. This far outweighs their simple facticity. The stories of the philosophy, you see, in its performed enacted state. Their purpose is didactic, not documentary.
So the ambiguity, the maybe legendary quality, that actually serves a purpose. It pushes us to look for the principle behind the story. That's interesting. To grasp that principle, then, maybe help us set the scene. What was the world like that you were reacting against? This is the 4th century BCE. What was happening in Athens that demanded such a radical, pushback?
The era in which I formulated my critique was defined by nothing less than a cataclysmic collapse of civic meaning. It was the twilight of the autonomous city-state, the polis, the very bedrock of Athenian life. This idea that the good man was intrinsically linked to being a good citizen was rendered utterly void, untenable.
Why? What happened?
The devastating aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, followed swiftly by the rise and imposition of Macedonian dominance first under Philip II, then his son, Alexander, simply shattered the sovereignty. The moral authority of the local democratic government evaporated.
So the old link between individual virtue and the city's health just broke.
Precisely. This induced a profound existential crisis for the Greek sense of self. The citizen, formerly an active participant, was suddenly reduced to a passive subject of a distant imperial power. The traditional framework deriving personal meaning from civic life, from voting, holding office, military service, it simply dissolved. When your moral flourishing depends on a crumbling state, where then do you locate eudaimonia?
Flourishing.
A fundamental question. My philosophy, alongside the other Hellenistic schools that followed the Stoics, the Epicureans arose explicitly to address this vacuum. We did so by relocating happiness entirely within the individual soul, rendering it absolute, independent of the state's fickle fortunes or political chaos. My radical anti-political stance, my deliberate devaluation of civic life as morally indifferent, was simply the most consistent and, yes, perhaps the most extreme response to this catastrophic loss of civic agency.
That context really helps frame it. It makes that turn inward towards individual self-sufficiency seem almost inevitable. And your own personal story famously begins with an act tied to this crisis of value, your exile from Sinope, linked to defacing the currency. Can you unpack the deeper meaning of paracoraxia into nomisma for us?
Yes. The literal incident leading to my exile involving my father Hesius, a mentor, and the alleged adulteration of Sinope's coinage. The precise details remain somewhat obscure. History is often murky on such points, but its symbolic resonance became the very genesis of my life's work. The term nomisma holds a crucial dual meaning in Greek. It signifies not merely currency, the physical coins,
Right.
but also critically custom, law, tradition, or convention, the whole established order.
Okay, so defacing the currency wasn't just about bad money.
Exactly. The alleged crime became the central organizing metaphor for my entire philosophical existence. I was in essence commanded, whether by an oracle or by circumstance, is debatable to deface the currency of society. This meant systematically, relentlessly exposing the entire edifice of human convention, all customs, laws, social values, hierarchies, as fundamentally arbitrary, counterfeit, lacking any intrinsic worth based in nature or reason. I wasn't merely critiquing flawed coinage, I was indicting the entire system of accepted yet unexamined values upon which society operated.
And the story about the oracle at Delphi telling you to do this.
That is likely a later philosophical fiction, perhaps a kind of parody even. But it serves its purpose, does it not? It reinforces the idea that this mission was necessary, perhaps even divinely sanctioned, by an authority higher than the corrupt laws of any particular polis.
That metaphor, defacing the counterfeit currency of convention, sets up the core conflict perfectly. If we're throwing out the fake money, we need to know what the real value is. Which brings us, I think, to the central pillar of Cynic thought: nature versus convention.
Indeed, the absolute bedrock of cynicism lies in this uncompromising opposition. Physis, or nature, versus nomos, or convention. Nomos represents the entire human-constructed architecture of society. Its laws, its demands for social decorum, its restrictive traditions, its artificial hierarchies of class, status, wealth, all of it. I maintain that this entire structure is artificial. Often it runs directly contrary to human reason, and it is inherently corrupting because it generates endless unnecessary desires and dependencies.
So nomos is everything we build up around ourselves?
Precisely. Whereas physis, nature, conversely, represents the simple, the rational, the unadorned order of the natural world, the cosmos itself. This natural order alone provides the reliable, the true standard for how a rational creature ought to live. The Cynic imperative, therefore, is clear. Live kata physin, in accordance with nature.
Okay, let me see if I'm tracking this. For the sake of our listeners, you're arguing that a truly authentic life means stripping away basically everything society's built up, because society's rules, the nomos, they just create artificial needs that corrupt us. And only the simple kind of primal reality of nature, physis, is a trustworthy guide. Have I got that right?
That is a concise and accurate distillation of the core philosophical premise, yes.
But here's where I, perhaps playing devil's advocate, push back a bit. Is all convention truly corrupting? I mean, did the polis offer some benefits? Stability, maybe? Collective defense? Written laws that could, in theory, protect the vulnerable? If you reject the entire edifice of nomos, aren't you also discarding potentially rational forms of social organization? And isn't physis, nature itself, sometimes, wow, harsh, arbitrary, even cruel? Why assume the natural world is a better moral teacher than reasoned human arrangements?
You mistake necessity perhaps for virtue. The laws you champion are fundamentally arbitrary agreements, designed primarily to protect property and maintain existing hierarchies, not to cultivate genuine human excellence or eto. When a human arrangement be a law, a custom, a standard of etiquette contradicts the simple dictates of nature, it is not merely incorrect, it is tyrannical. Nature dictates sufficiency. Nomos inevitably promotes excess. Nature dictates that basic bodily functions are neutral acts. Nomos arbitrarily decrees them shameful and private. My position is that the natural world offers a superior model, precisely because it remains uncorrupted by human vanity, by avarice, by the lust for power and status. The true standard is found in simplicity. Why introduce complexities where none are required by reason? The authentic life is discovered in conforming to the few, clear, rational demands of the body and the soul, unburdened by the vast, complex, and often contradictory demands imposed by established society.
I see. That focus on simplicity, on stripping away the non-essential, leads us directly to the goal then. If we reject all the typical goals society sets, wealth, status, reputation, even comfort, what is the ultimate aim, the telos of the Cynic life? What's left to strive for?
The ultimate goal, the telos, of human existence is indeed eudaimonia, flourishing, genuine happiness, a life lived well. However, following a rigorous, some might say severe, interpretation of Socratic ethics, I posit that this flourishing is achieved exclusively through, all right,
Which means,
virtue, excellence, moral and intellectual integrity. This leads directly to the foundational and admittedly often confronting claim of cynicism.
yeah,
Virtue is the only good. Nothing else possesses intrinsic value.
the only good. That's radical.
It is. This ethical simplification relegates everything else that humanity typically chases, health, physical pleasure, longevity, reputation, certainly material wealth, into the category of the morally indifferent. They are adiaphora. They possess no inherent value that contributes to the goodness of one's soul, to true eudaimonia. In fact, they frequently become positive evils if they distract the individual from the singular internal pursuit of virtue.
So health isn't good. Wealth isn't good.
They are indifferent. They can be used well or poorly, but they do not in themselves constitute the good life. Only virtue does. This radical reclassification of value is precisely what the Stoics, who inherited much from Cynicism, would later recognize and term the short path to virtue. It makes the good life accessible to anyone immediately, regardless of their external circumstances or fortune. The Cynic is impervious to misfortune because misfortune can only touch those things already deemed morally indifferent.
Okay, so the goal is arito, virtue, achieved through intense focus, and the strategy is living according to nature, stripping away convention. This sounds difficult. It requires immense effort, surely, which brings us to what you might call the pillars of the Cynic life in practice. How does one actually achieve this kind of detachment and freedom, especially when, let's be honest, most of us are naturally drawn towards comfort, ease, and what society approves of?
The cornerstone of this freedom, a freedom which I must stress must be actively earned and maintained daily, is autarkeia, radical self-sufficiency. True freedom is utterly contingent upon non-dependence. Happiness remains unattainable as long as one's well-being is subject to external variables, whether possessions, the fickle opinions of the crowd, or the inevitable blows of fortune. The true sage, the Cynic sage, must possess all that is truly necessary for the good life entirely within himself. This renders him functionally untouchable by external forces.
Self-contained, almost.
Entirely. The path toward autarkeia is one of relentless reduction of needs. Consider the well-known anecdote of the wooden cup. For a time, I possessed a simple cup, deeming it necessary for drinking. Yet, upon observing a peasant boy drinking water from a stream using only his cupped hands, I immediately discarded my cup. The realization was stark. I was still burdened by something unnecessary, something conventional. The natural minimum need is always lower than we habitually assume.
Wow, he just threw it away.
It served no essential purpose. This constant interrogation of necessity, this seeking of the absolute minimum, is paramount. Furthermore, recall the incident when my slave, Manes, absconded. Others urged me to pursue him to reclaim my property. My response: if Manes can live without Diogenes, why not Diogenes without Manes?
Right.
This illustrates the essential, liberating truth. The highest form of freedom is freedom from the need for dependency itself, even the dependency implicit in mastery over another.
That relentless reduction of needs, it sounds like more than just a mental shift. It sounds physically demanding, like a kind of, well, boot camp for the soul.
Right.
For our listeners, self-sufficiency might sound like a simple attitude, but how exactly does one train the self, both body and mind, for that kind of unwavering resilience against hardship and desire?
Virtue, for the Cynic, is emphatically not abstract theoretical knowledge. It is an embodied skill, a practical expertise. To achieve autarkeia and the internal freedom it confers, one requires rigorous discipline, what we term ascoesis. It is precisely analogous to an athlete training the body for physical excellence, preparing for the games. The philosopher must train his soul by deliberately embracing hardship, by confronting discomfort head-on. This serves to inoculate the self against the debilitating effects of desire and the sudden shock of misfortune.
So you intentionally sought out discomfort.
Indeed, these were not eccentricities for their own sake. I would deliberately roll in the scorching sand during the height of summer, forcing my body to accommodate extreme heat and thirst. In winter, I would embrace snow-covered bronze statues, habituating myself to the biting cold. I walked barefoot year-round, regardless of the terrain or temperature.
Why? What was the specific goal of, say, hugging a cold statue?
The goal of ascosis is to prove conclusively to the self that physical pain and discomfort are morally indifferent. They belong to the category of adaphora. By successfully training the body to endure what the comfortable conventional man fears, the mind simultaneously dismantles its attachment to fleeting pleasures and eradicates its fear of unavoidable suffering. The physical and mental exercises are inseparable. A virtuous mind requires a disciplined body, capable of executing reason's dictates without protest or complaint.
That level of discipline is, frankly, almost unimaginable today. But that training, that cultivated indifference to convention and comfort, it leads us to the practice that is, let's be direct, the most shocking to conventional sensibilities, an idea: shamelessness. For many modern listeners, this just translates to public crudeness, maybe even exhibitionism. Can you explain an idea not just as offensive behavior, but as a precise philosophical, you called it a non-discursive argument?
An idea is precisely that: a deliberate, performative critique. It functions as a non-discursive argument launched directly against the tyranny of nomos. By openly carrying out natural biological functions in the public square, eating where custom forbids, urinating where deemed improper, even acts of self-gratification, I commit a systemic, visible violation of social convention. The intention, understand, is never mere childish provocation or desire to offend for its own sake.
Okay.
It is the practical demonstration of a core liberating principle. What is natural cannot, by definition, be shameful. Nature itself assigns no shame to these acts, only nomos does.
So the shock value is part of the point.
The shock forces reflection. The practice serves a crucial dual function. Epistemologically, it compels the observer to interrogate the basis of their own immediate, visceral reaction of shame or disgust. Is this discomfort grounded in absolute reason, in nature? Or is it merely the product of unquestioning obedience to inherited, culturally arbitrary convention? Politically, an idea denies the legitimacy of the polis, the established social order, to arbitrarily regulate and privatize the fundamentally natural aspects of human existence. The shame you might feel witnessing me eat a simple meal where convention prohibits eating is the shame manufactured by nomos, not the shame inherent in the act of eating itself.
I think I grasped the principle, but here's my challenge to that. If the purpose of an idea is ultimately educational, to guide people towards virtue by questioning convention, doesn't the sheer shock value the potential disgust? The outrage it clearly provokes risk alienating the very audience you're trying to reach. Isn't this kind of radical, uncompromising cynicism by its very nature antisocial? And doesn't that contradict the Socratic ideal of improving the lives of one's fellow citizens through dialogue?
That question presumes that the philosopher's primary duty is to be popular or persuasive in the conventional sense, to be liked. The cynic's duty is not to be liked, but to be true. If the majority finds the unvarnished truth repellent, the fault lies with their corrupted sensibilities, their enslavement to nomos, not with the truth itself. I identified myself as the self-appointed watchdog of humanity, the coon. It is the watchdog's moral obligation to bark, to bite, if necessary, and to expose hypocrisy relentlessly, regardless of the discomfort it causes.
The watchdog.
My goal is not gradual conversion through gentle discourse. It is the sharp, perhaps shocking moment of sudden recognition and awakening for the few who possess the capacity to see the world stripped bare of its conventional illusions. I often remark that other dogs bite their enemies. I bite my friends to save them, referring to the sharp rebukes intended to sting individuals into self-awareness.
That self-mastery, then, that freedom from needing approval or fearing disapproval, directly enables the fourth pillar, your practice of fearless, frank speech, parrhesia.
Precisely. This radical freedom of speech, parrhesia, derives entirely and directly from autarkeia. Because the cynic sage needs nothing that society can bestow and fears nothing that society can threaten, no loss of reputation, no confiscation of fortune, no revocation of security, he alone can speak with absolute, unvarnished frankness. This moral immunity constitutes my true power.
And the anecdote of the lantern perfectly illustrates this, doesn't it?
It encapsulates the critique enabled by parrhesia. I wandered the Athenian agora, the very heart of commerce, politics, and social life in broad daylight, conspicuously holding a lit lamp, weaving through the bustling crowds. When inevitably accosted and asked what I was doing, my reply was simple yet profound. I am looking for a man.
Often translated as an honest man.
A common mistranslation that diminishes the critique. It was not merely a search for honesty, but a far deeper indictment. I was implying that my contemporaries, utterly absorbed in convention, the pursuit of status, in chasing counterfeit values dictated by nomos, had fundamentally lost their essential true humanity. Their rational, natural selves were obscured. They were no longer fully human.
Wow, that's a heavy charge.
Truth often is.
And perhaps no demonstration of this fearless speech confronting worldly power is more iconic than your legendary encounter with Alexander the Great. That single exchange seems to capture the entire clash between the philosopher king and the, well, actual king.
The meeting provided, indeed, a perfect tableau of contrasting realities, of opposing powers. Alexander, the undisputed master of a vast material empire, backed by unparalleled military force, approached me. I was merely sunning myself, enjoying the warmth, one of the few true resources freely available from nature. He offered, with the characteristic arrogance of limitless worldly power, to grant me any favor, any wish within his capacity. My reply, uttered from a position of complete self-mastery and non-dependence, was the ultimate expression of autarkeia. Stand out of my light.
Just move aside.
It starkly presented the confrontation between two irreconcilable forms of kingship. Alexander's dominion over lands, peoples, and armies versus my absolute dominion over the self, the ultimate freedom born from needing nothing that material power could possibly bestow or, indeed, take away.
Incredible. Okay, let's shift gears slightly and talk about your intellectual roots and relationships. Many see you as carrying on the Socratic tradition, but pushing it to an extreme, maybe even an anarchic conclusion. How do you see your debt to Socrates, and where did your paths diverge so dramatically?
My debt to Socrates is undeniable, foundational even. One could accurately describe my work as radicalizing the Socratic impulse. I took his core concerns, the absolute primacy of ethics over abstract metaphysics, the pronounced disdain for excessive wealth and public adulation, the relentless demand for self-examination, and pushed them to their most consistent, practical, and embodied conclusions. Plato's famous quip, likely uttered with a degree of horror, describing me as a Socrates gone mad, serves as an accurate, if perhaps unwilling, acknowledgement of our shared philosophical lineage. We both placed virtue above all else.
But the madness was in the method.
The divergence was absolute in method and in engagement with the polis. Socrates functioned as the city's intellectual gadfly, stinging the Athenian conscience with probing, critical questions, aiming for moral improvement from within the existing civic structure. He engaged in dialogue. I, by contrast, deliberately cultivated the persona of the city's dog, the kunj, a far more aggressive, biting, uncompromising critic, one who barked, threatened, and lived deliberately as a social outcast to embody and enforce the philosophical critique through performance. Where Socrates sought, perhaps, to perfect the citizen, I sought to dismantle the very concept of citizenship in favor of a universal humanity.
That image, the dog versus the gadfly, is powerful. Now, speaking of lineage, there's the traditional account, mostly from Diogenes Laertius again, that places you as a direct pupil of Antisthenes, who himself was a pupil of Socrates. There are even stories of you persisting, enduring his rejection, to become his student. But, and this is where modern scholarship raises questions, contemporary sources who knew Antisthenes don't seem to link him directly to you, or even call him a cynic. Some scholars now suggest this formal teacher-student link might be a later invention, maybe something the early Stoics constructed to give their own school a clean line back through you to Socrates. What's your perspective on this? Was that formal tutelage under Antisthenes' historical fact, or perhaps a pious fiction, as some suggest, designed to bolster Cynicism's authority?
The Antisthenes question. The academic debate regarding the precise nature of my instruction, or lack thereof, under Antisthenes continues, does it not? I was undoubtedly influenced by his known ascetic leanings and his focus on Socratic ethics. That much seems clear from the resonances. However, the notion of a formal, direct tutelage, yes, it may indeed be a pious fiction, as you phrase it, possibly engineered by subsequent philosophical schools seeking to solidify a neat, unimpeachable historical pedigree stretching back to the revered Socratic origin. The truth, in this particular matter, appears somewhat contested, much like the precise historical detail of many chreiai. Even I, relying as I must on ongoing research to fully reconstruct my own historical context, must acknowledge that the exact nature of that relationship remains unclear, a subject for continued investigation.
That uncertainty itself is interesting. What's definitely not uncertain is the intense philosophical battle you waged with Plato. Those encounters are legendary. Was this primarily a clash of personalities? Or was it a fundamental, systematic opposition covering metaphysics, politics, the whole philosophical spectrum?
The encounters with Plato were absolutely systematic. Necessary collisions stemming from fundamentally opposed philosophical commitments across every significant domain, from metaphysics to ethics to politics. He represented the kind of abstract idealism, the flight from lived reality, that I viewed as entirely superfluous at best and actively corrupting at worst. His focus on a supposed higher realm of non-material forms diverted critical attention from the immediate, practical, ethical demands of actual human life.
Can you give an example of this clash? The chicken story comes to mind.
Yes, the featherless biped. A perfect illustration of my theatrical pragmatism confronting his abstract definitions. Plato founded his entire system on the theory of forms, positing this higher intelligible reality of abstract ideas, the form of the good, the form of tableness, and so forth, as somehow more real than the physical objects we actually encounter. I met this abstraction with concrete, performative ridicule. When he offered his famous definition of a human being as simply a featherless biped, I took the trouble to procure a chicken, pluck it bare, and present it directly within the grounds of his academy, declaring, "Behold Plato's human being."
What happened then?
It forced him, amidst likely embarrassment and consternation, to amend his definition, adding the rather specific qualifier, with broad, flat nails. A small victory for empirical reality over abstract categorization. Similarly, regarding his elaborate discourse on the supposed abstract ideas or forms of tablehood and cuphood, my critique was straightforward and empirical. I stated plainly, "Table and cup I see, but your tablehood and cuphood, Plato, I can no wise see." Philosophy's focus must remain on the tangible, lived reality that directly impacts our moral choices and actions, not on unseen speculative intellectual constructions.
And politically, your visions couldn't have been more different, could they? Plato's highly structured republic versus your own, apparently advocating for something closer to anarchy.
Total inverses indeed. Plato's Republic describes a meticulously planned, rigidly hierarchical, aristocratic utopia, governed by philosopher-kings, where order and justice are entirely contingent upon strict adherence to one's designated social function and class. My own lost work, also titled Republic, fragments and summaries of which survive, advocated for a radically different vision altogether. A kind of proto-anarchist utopia, predicated on the immediate abolition of the state itself, the dissolution of private property, and the complete dismantling of the conventional institutions of marriage and the nuclear family. I proposed instead a universal community, a koinonia. My vision rejected all coercive, written law in favor of relying solely on universal, unwritten natural law grounded in reason.
It sounds incredibly radical even now.
The distinction in our approaches to political freedom and the necessity of moral compromise is perfectly captured, I believe, in the anecdote concerning our respective dining arrangements. When Plato was observed dining at the court of the tyrant Diogenes of Syracuse, presumably seeking patronage and influence, I, occupied with washing simple vegetables for my own meager, self-sufficient meal, chided him directly. "If you knew how to wash vegetables," I remarked, "you wouldn't have to pay court to Dionysius."
And Plato's response.
His retort, equally revealing, was, "If you knew how to pay court to Dionysius, you wouldn't have to wash vegetables." This exchange neatly encapsulates our fundamentally opposing stances on freedom, necessity, and the moral compromises inevitably demanded by material ambition and entanglement in political power structures.
Fascinating. Despite your, let's say, marginal social status during your own lifetime, your philosophical influence, particularly on the subsequent Hellenistic schools like Stoicism, was immense. How did that happen? How did the Cynic torch get passed to the Stoics, and how did they manage to adapt your philosophy without fully embracing the radical lifestyle?
The intellectual lineage is quite direct and generally undisputed, although the ethical application underwent a dramatic alteration. I instructed Crates of Thebes. He, in true adherence to Cynic principles, famously renounced his considerable family wealth and became, like me, a wandering street sage, living out the philosophy publicly. Crates, in turn, instructed Zeno of Citium, and Zeno, of course, went on to found the Stoic school. Indeed, Zeno's own early political work, his Republic, was explicitly acknowledged in antiquity as having been written, metaphorically speaking, on the dog's tail, a clear homage to its profound Cynic roots and inspiration.
So the core ideas carried over.
Absolutely. The Stoics adopted the central tenets of Cynic ethics. The unwavering assertion that virtue is the only good, the fundamental imperative of living according to nature, and the studied cultivation of indifference toward external factors like wealth, health, or reputation. However, Stoicism performed a crucial, and one might argue, highly pragmatic modification. They effectively socialized the ethics. They adapted Cynicism, making it compatible with civic life and palatable for both the ruling elite and the ordinary citizen.
How did they manage that? What was the key change?
The critical difference lies in the redefinition of nature, of physis. For the Cynic, myself included, physis meant primarily the pre-social, instinctual life, rigorously stripped bare of all convention, often exemplified by the behavior of animals who live without complex societal rules. For the Stoics, however, nature came to encompass innate human rationality, and crucially, our inherent capacity for sociability. Living according to their conception of nature therefore included participating rationally in society, upholding just laws, and diligently fulfilling one's social roles and duties, what they termed kathekanta.
So fulfilling duties wasn't seen as corrupting convention, but as natural for humans.
Precisely. For a Stoic, these actions were not corrupting conventions to be rejected, but rather natural expressions of human reason and our place in the rational cosmos. They retained the rigorous ethical core of Cynicism virtue as the sole good, indifference to externals, but ingeniously adapted it for those who wished to remain engaged members of the community, even holding positions of responsibility. This was a necessary compromise, perhaps, which allowed Stoicism to become so influential, but it was a compromise impossible for a true, uncompromising cynic.
That subtle but crucial shift from an antisocial physis to a rational social physis explains perfectly why Stoicism became a philosophy embraced by Roman senators and emperors, while Cynicism largely remained the philosophy of the outsider, the critic on the margins. But your rejection of the polis, the city-state, also led to another incredibly powerful idea that the Stoics also picked up and developed: cosmopolitanism. If you rejected citizenship in Sinope and then Athens, what was your ultimate allegiance? Where did you belong?
That very question prompted what has become perhaps my most famous political statement. When interrogated about my origins, where do you come from? What is your city, your polis? My unwavering reply was, I am a citizen of the world. Cosmopolites.
The first recorded use of that concept, wasn't it?
It appears to be the first explicit articulation of cosmopolitanism as a philosophical stance in the Western tradition, yes. By rejecting the binding ties of local, man-made affiliations, the accident of birth in a particular city, I affirm my allegiance instead to the entire cosmos, the universal community governed by reason and nature. This idea is predicated on the existence of a universal natural law, what I sometimes refer to as the correct constitution, existing in the cosmos itself, which transcends and necessarily judges the particular, often arbitrary and unjust, conventional laws of any given human city. This concept of a higher universal natural law provides a robust philosophical foundation that goes far beyond mere negation or rejection of existing structures.
And this rejection of the state, combined with the vision in your Lost Republic, does that place you among the earliest anarchist thinkers?
My systematic rejection of the legitimacy and necessity of coercive state structures, coupled with the positive vision reportedly outlined in my Republic, advocating for a society without government, without private property, without codified law, based purely on natural reason and voluntary association, certainly establishes me as one of the earliest identifiable proto-anarchist thinkers in the Western tradition.
It's striking how, given that your philosophy was such an extreme reaction to the specific crisis of the ancient Greek city-state, so many of your core ideas feel incredibly relevant today. Your critique of materialism, the emphasis on self-sufficiency, the call for authenticity, they seem to echo quite strongly in the 21st century.
It is perhaps a testament, is it not, to the perennial nature of human folly. Our species seems relentlessly inventive in creating unnecessary complexities, artificial needs, and dependencies that obscure the path to a simple, virtuous life. My influence has indeed surfaced repeatedly throughout history. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, explicitly identified me as a key model for his concept of the free spirit, the individual capable of living beyond conventional morality, creating his own values.
And his parable of the madman?
Nietzsche's famed parable of the madman entering the marketplace carrying a lit lantern in daylight to announce the death of God is a direct, conscious homage to my own search through the agora for a genuine human being. Both scenarios depict a radical truth-teller arriving perhaps too soon, confronting a complacent, self-satisfied society with a reality it is utterly unprepared or unwilling to accept.
And today, where do you see the resonance now?
Today, my core philosophical challenges find clear resonance in contemporary critiques of rampant materialism and consumer culture. The emphasis on radical simplicity, the quest for an authentic existence, free from the crushing pressures of public opinion, particularly the relentless pursuit of fleeting status symbols and external validation, aligns closely with modern movements focused on things like minimalism, anti-consumerism, and finding purpose beyond material acquisition. The ancient call to live a simple, virtuous life in accordance with nature remains, I suspect, the most potent and relevant challenge to individuals currently drowning in unnecessary complexity, psychological dependence on social approval, and an insatiable obsession with accumulating possessions.
This has been absolutely fascinating. You really do compel us to face that uncomfortable gap between what's truly necessary and all the superfluous things we cling to. You know, your historical existence might have been quite marginal in your own time. You were an outcast, after all, famously asking to be left unburied, like refuse when you died. But the paradox is that the myth of Diogenes, this powerful collection of unforgettable stories and gestures, has been incredibly successful. It ensured your philosophical challenge continues to provoke and inspire. You really do remain the ultimate unaccommodated man. We've talked about how you stripped away conventions of wealth, power, status, even basic shame to achieve this state of autarkeia, self-sufficiency. So, for you listening today, living in a world arguably obsessed with validation, online status, and instant gratification, here's a final thought to maybe chew on. If virtue truly is the only good, and everything external health, wealth, reputation, comfort is ultimately indifferent, what modern conventions are you carrying around? Maybe it's career status, the constant curation of an online persona, the endless chase for the next upgrade or fleeting comfort. What would the watchdog of Sinope compel you right now to recognize as counterfeit currency and discard? Thank you so much for joining us for this session of AI History of Western Philosophy. If our conversation today sparked any new thoughts or questions for you, please do consider liking, subscribing, or leaving a comment wherever you found us. We appreciate the engagement. Goodbye for now.